Testing one, two, three. Testing one, two, three. Okay. Hello. Welcome to Dis and Dat, 22 October. We've now looked at chapter 7 of Dussel on Marx's economic manuscripts of 1861 to 63, and we're looking at the editor's introduction and the author's introduction. That's what we're going to look at today. And we didn't get too far in the editor's introduction. Um, and I think we're down somewhere on Roman numeral 23 or so, 24. And well, we'll start somewhere in there. Subsection 1. There's a thing by Kohei Saito that I will probably read after this on Friday, probably introduce on Friday. Um, anyway, between August 1861 and July 1863, Marx wrote 23 notebooks, which were published in German for the first time between 1967 and 1982. This material was consulted by Engels and Kautsky in order to publish so-called books 2, 3, and 4 of Capital. Unknown to the later Marxist tradition, these notebooks consist of 1,472 manuscript pages. Oh, sorry, I'm a little ahead of myself. Not that that wasn't interesting piece of information. We're back over here. Sorry to say, because I can't read Roman numerals. Um, 30 manuscript pages later, while working on Jones, Marx broke off again to write a general outline of both the part one on the production process of capital and part three on capital and profit, the MECW 33 pages 346 to 7. Point two of the outline of part 3.2 of the outline of part 3 is the formation of the general rate of profit. So Marx must have had this general outline in mind when he wrote the detailed outline 30 pages later. But what is most remarkable about this outline is that part 3 on capital and profit has been greatly expanded. It now includes not only aspects of capital in general, included in the draft of a few weeks before, but also all the individual forms of the distribution of surplus value that Marx has been working on over the past year. Ever since his encounter with Rodbertus, equal rates of profit, rent, interest, and commercial profit. These individual forms of surplus value are at the level of analysis of competition, beyond capital in general. Marx's work on these subjects over the previous year must have convinced him that they should be included in Section 3 on capital and profit, rather than waiting for a later separate volume on competition, which Marx no doubt realized by this time that he would probably never write. Oakley's book of 83, pages 82 to 110, also emphasizes Marx's expansion of the contents of capital and profit to include aspects of competition and the distribution of surplus value besides capital in general. Dussel argues that the individual forms of surplus value explained in Volume 3 of Capital do not exhaust the analysis of competition. Many other, more concrete aspects of competition still remain to be analyzed after Volume 3. For example, market prices, monopoly credit, international competition, etc. Therefore, Dussel concludes that there are two levels of competition in Marx's logical structure. Number one, general abstract competition, as in Volume 3, and number two, more concrete aspects of competition, which would be analyzed after Volume 3. Dussel emphasizes the importance of this outline of Volume 3 with its radically expanded concerns it definitively clarified for the first time. This outline is, in a sense, the main result of Marx's very productive exploratory work on his theory of the distribution of surplus value during the previous year. Footnote 4. This outline is very close to the final version of Volume 3, which Marx wrote in the next 2 years, 1864 to 5, which is what we were looking at before. Evidently, Marx's work on the manuscripts of 1861 to 63 clarified his thinking to such an extent on these issues that he was now ready to write this volume. The fact that this 1864 to 5 draft of Volume 3 although certainly not polished for publication, is as clear as and complete as it is further evidence of the clarity Marx achieved while working on these 1861 to 3 manuscripts. Here is, of course, the description, the table 1 of Marx's manuscripts within 1861 to 63, and you can see how widely dispersed they are. How there's a continuity of the theories of surplus value, which is why we're looking at it now. And of course, we know that theories of surplus value got pushed forward, right? Dussel emphasizes that the main conclusions of Marx's theory of the distribution of surplus value is that all these different forms of surplus value have the same underlying source, that is, the surplus labor of workers. These different forms of surplus value appear to bourgeois economists to have their own separate and independent sources, but this is a fetishism which necessarily results from their capitalist perspective. Marx's theory demonstrates that all these different forms of surplus value are, in fact, derived from the surplus labor of workers. This general conclusion was first sketched out, as we have seen, in the section on revenue and its sources in the manuscripts of 61 to 63, and then later elaborated more fully in the concluding part 7 of Volume 3 with the same title, Revenue and Its Sources. Section number 4, Roman numeral 25, Editor's Introduction. 4. Completion of the draft of Volume 1, Notebooks 20 to 23, the MECW 33, pages 372 to 372-34, 354. After finishing with Jones, Marx returned to the draft of his theory of surplus value, Volume 1, that he'd broken off from 10 months before to begin theories of surplus value. He returned to where he had left off, to Part 4 on relative surplus value and the different forms of relative surplus value, and then continued with Part 5 on absolute surplus value and relative surplus value combined. Part 6, that is later Part 7 on the accumulation of capital, and briefly Part 7, later Part 8 on primitive accumulation. Now, if you can remember all that, with respect to relative surplus value, Dussel emphasizes that the technological truth of capitalism is in the transition of the handicraft workshop to the mechanized factory, which results in the real subsumption of labor under capital. Not only does the worker have to work under the control of capitalists, which is formal subsumption, but also in the day-to-day work of the factory, the worker becomes a mere appendage to machines and is completely dominated by the technological structure of production. In other words, living labor is really and actually dominated by dead labor. Dussel emphasizes this same theme of the domination of dead labor over living labor in its discussion of the section on accumulation. With accumulation, domination is raised to a higher degree. With accumulation, the capital used to purchase the labor power of the worker is itself the result of past unpaid surplus, that is, stolen labor. The worker is now exploited by his own past product as the alien property of another. A transfer has taken place, right, of some kind, which is the ultimate in alienation. Past, objectified, alien surplus labor becomes a means of appropriating even more surplus living labor. In Marx's vivid metaphor, workers make their own golden chains. Subsection 5, Marx's concept of science. The last part of Dussel's book consists of two chapters which are more interpretive in nature. The first chapter, the Manuscripts of 1861 and the Philosophy of Liberation, summarizes Dussel's interpretation of Marx's concept of science, or the logical method used by Marx in the construction of his theory of capitalism. There are two main aspects of Marx's logical method that are emphasized by Dussel. The first aspect is the critique of appearances and the passage to the essence, which has to do with the preliminary work that is necessary before Marx began his theory of capitalism. The critique of appearances is the critique of fetishism, i.e., critique of the failure to relate all of the market phenomena of money and prices and income to living labor. The passage to the essence is the identification of living labor as the radical starting point of Marx's theory. The essence is living labor. Labor is the creative source that produces all value and surplus value. There is no other source of value and surplus value. All other economic categories of money and prices are derived in one way or another from living labor. Let me break here for the moment. And the point, of course, of living labor is labor in its most complete sense. It's not like thinking of manual labor. It is also including cognitive labor. So it's really important to get that sort of sense, extrapolate that sense from this supposition. All right, back to the text. After arriving at living labor as the starting point, the second main aspect of Marx's logical method, according to Dussel, is the explanation of the market phenomena of money and prices and incomes from this starting point of living labor, i.e., the explanation of these phenomena as the necessary forms of appearance of living labor. See, it's a lived experience, right? Back to the text. Marx's theory proceeds step by logical step, deriving all the economic categories from previous categories and ultimately from living labor without gaps or leaps in the logic. This is what Dussel calls the development of the concept of living labor, or the constitution of the categories of the concept of living labor. An important example of Marx's logical method of the strict derivation of categories is the key category of prices of production. According to Marx's theory, prices of production depend in part on the general rate of profit. The general rate of profit, in turn, depends on the total surplus value produced in the capitalist economy as a whole and the total capital invested. The total surplus value and the total capital invested are themselves determined in the Volume 1 analysis of capital in general, and then used in strict logical order to determine the general rate of profit and prices of production. In this way, the Volume 1 analysis of capital in general, that is, the total surplus value, is a necessary intermediate link, as Marx often said, in the explanation of prices of production in Volume 3. Marx argued that Ricardo's theory failed primarily because he did not follow this logical method. Instead, Ricardo simply assumed the general rate of profits as given without providing an explanation of its determination, i.e., without providing the necessary intermediate links. This failure left a huge logical gap in Ricardo's theory, which resulted in many other problems. A related example of Marx's logical method and the insufficiency of Ricardo's logic is the category of absolute rent. We have seen above that Marx discovered early in the manuscripts of 1861 to 63 in his critical confrontation with Rodbertus that, in order to explain absolute rent, one must first explain prices of production. This is the logical procedure Marx followed in Volume 3. That is, prices of production are first derived in Part 2, derived from the prior Volume 1 analysis of capital in general, and then rent. Both absolute and differential rent are derived in Part 6 on the basis of the prior Part 2 theories of prices of production. Once again, Marx argued that Ricardo failed to explain absolute rent because he had not provided the necessary intermediate links. In this case, Ricardo had not explained the determination of prices of production, which meant that he could not explain absolute rent. Dussel emphasizes that Marx's logical method of the development of the concept and the derivation of the necessary forms of appearance from an underlying essence or substance through dialectic logic was heavily influenced by Hegel. Dussel argues that in this respect, Althusser was completely wrong. There was no epistemological break with Hegel between the young Marx and the old Marx. The old Marx did not reject Hegel. Rather, the old Marx remained as much Hegelian as the young Marx, if not more so, and hence problematic for the entire 1960s and 70s. To be sure, Dussel argues that Marx used Schelling to invent Hegel or invert Hegel. Dussel argues that Marx used Schelling to invert Hegel, as we have seen above. However, Marx's logic and capital continue to be profoundly influenced by Hegel. The basic logical structure of Marx's theory remained essentially the same throughout the four drafts of Capital, from the first draft in the Grundrisse to the final published version of Volume 1. There is no evidence of an epistemological break in these four drafts of Capital. Althusser, of course, did not have access to all these four drafts, so his mistake is perhaps. But there is no such excuse for Althusserians today. Dussel also emphasizes that Capital not only provides a theory of capitalism, but also offers a fundamental ethical critique of capitalism. Marx's critique of capitalism is ethical because it challenges the prevailing morality of capitalist society. Morality, according to Dussel, means the whole set of ideologies that justify the existing status quo, i.e., any given economic and social system. For example, according to capitalist morality, the relation between capitalists and workers is one of free and equal exchange to the mutual benefit of both parties. Workers receive a wage which is equal to their contribution to production, and capitalists receive a profit which is equal to their contribution to production or the contribution of the machines they own. All is fair in this egalitarian world of capitalism from the perspective of capitalist morality. Marx's theory poses a fundamental challenge to this prevailing capitalist morality. Marx's theory shows that the worker's wage is only part of the value they produce, and that the other part of the value they produce is appropriated by capitalists as their surplus value. The different forms of surplus value, that is, profit, interest, rent, etc., appear to bourgeois economists, reflecting their capitalist perspective, to be the result of separate and independent sources. But Marx's theory demonstrates that all these different forms of surplus value, that is, profit, interest, rent, etc., are in fact derived from the surplus labor of workers. According to Marx's theory, the exchange between capitalists and workers on the market, where all appears to be free and equal, is not the end of the relation between these two economic classes. It is only the beginning. After the exchange on the market, their relation continues in the hidden abode of production, where workers perform surplus labor for capitalists. In other words, workers in capitalism are exploited just like serfs in feudalism and slaves in slavery. This is the profound ethical critique provided by Marx's theory of capitalism. Surplus value is robbery, theft, stolen life. Dussel concludes this chapter by arguing that Latin American philosophy of liberation has a lot to learn from Marx and should incorporate Marx's critical scientific method and should apply and extend this method to understand the necessary conditions for liberation of the poor and exploited workers in Latin America and around the world. Subsection 6, Roman numeral 28, page 28. Editor's introduction, number 6, dependency and Marx's theory of the distribution of surplus value. This last chapter of Dussel's book presents his very innovative and important theory of dependency based on Marx's theory of competition and the distribution of surplus value, which, as we have seen, Marx began to develop in the manuscripts of 1861 to 63. Dussel argues that Marx's theory in the book Capital is very abstract and far from complete. Dussel calculates that Marx was able to finish only 1/72nd, 1/72nd of his overall theoretical plan. Therefore, we ourselves have the task of further developing Marx's theory towards more concrete levels and toward a better understanding of contemporary capitalism. This chapter itself provides an excellent example of this type of creative development of Marx's theory in order to explain important aspects of contemporary capitalist reality. Dussel argues that the dependency of less developed nations Dussel argues that the dependency of less developed peripheral countries on more developed center countries is located within Marx's theory at the level of competition, or has to do with the distribution of surplus value. As we've seen, this is precisely the area of Marx's theory that he worked on and developed the most in the manuscripts of 1861 to 63. However, Marx's discussion remains at a very high level of abstraction and does not consider more concrete factors such as the international distribution of surplus value. Dussel extends Marx's theory to this international dimension and to the crucial question of dependency in contemporary capitalism, as might be interested to someone who lived in Argentina and lived in Mexico. In particular, dependency has to do with primarily the intra-industry competition and the concepts of market value, individual value, super profits, and loss of profits, which, as we have seen above, Marx began to develop in a critical confrontation with Ricardo's theory of differential rent in the manuscripts of 61 to 63. Intra-industry competition is competition within a given industry, right? Between different producers with different levels of technology and productivity. Despite these differences in productivity and thus different individual values of the commodities produced, the given commodity tends to have a single price on the market. In this case, The price of the given commodity is determined by the average value of all the commodities of this kind on what Marx called the market value, as opposed to the individual values of the commodities of each producer. For producers with above average productivity, the individual value of their commodities is less than the market value. Therefore, these high productivity producers will receive a super profit when the commodities are sold at their market value. Inversely, for producers with below average productivity, the individual value of their commodities is greater than the market value. Therefore, these low productivity producers will suffer a loss of profit when the commodities are sold at their market value. In other words, there is a transfer of surplus value from low productivity producers to high productivity producers as a result of the normal mechanism of intra industry competition in capitalist economies. Dussel extends Marx's theory of intra-industry competition and market value to the crucial question of dependency. In today's global capitalist economy, the low productivity producers are in the, yes, underdeveloped peripheral countries, and the high production producers are in the center countries. Therefore, there is a transfer of surplus value from the peripheral countries to the center countries, i.e., super profits for the center countries and loss of profits for the peripheral countries. Capital export occurs, in other words. Quote, the essence of dependency, Dussel argues, is the transfer of surplus value from the less developed to the more developed countries. Monopoly power of various types of the center countries will increase the surplus value transferred to the center countries. But Dussel argues that even without monopoly power, the normal competitive mechanism of the world capitalist economy results in a transfer of surplus value from poor countries to rich countries, which of course further impoverishes the poor countries and continues and exacerbates their problem of dependency. Let me break here and note, of course, that there is a intra-regional, kind of disparity between, profits made in the city as opposed to profits made in more rural areas, right? Or the relation of port cities to interior cities, etc. Okay, back to the text. The implications of Dussel's theory of dependency based on Marx's theory of competition and the distribution of surplus value are truly profound. Dussel's theory implies that the situation of dependency and the transfer of surplus value from the poor countries to the rich countries will continue, as long as the poor countries remain behind the rich countries in technology and productivity. Now, this seems likely to continue for a very long time. Furthermore, Dussel's theory suggests that the problem of dependency will not be overcome by the elimination of the various monopoly privileges of the rich countries. It also suggests that the class struggle by itself within the underdeveloped countries is not enough to end the exploitation of workers. National liberation is also necessary in order to overcome the problem of dependency, i.e., the transfer of surplus value produced by workers in underdeveloped countries to capitalists in the advanced countries. An entirely new world economy is necessary in order to end the exploitation of workers in underdeveloped countries. Dussel concludes again that the urgent task of Latin American philosophy of liberation is to further develop Marx's theory and to discover in it new possibilities based on the people's praxis of national liberation, based on the logic of the majorities, but of the majorities as subjects of the history of liberation. Subsection 7, conclusion. Dussel argues in this book that Marxian scholars and Latin American philosophy of liberation in particular have the urgent task of understanding Marx's theory better and more thoroughly in order to be able to further develop this theory and apply it to the widespread and urgent social needs and problems of today's global capitalist economy. Marxian theory provides the best available explanation of the continuing and pervasive poverty around the world. We now have almost all of Marx's manuscripts available to us for the first time, at least in German, and most of them in English translation. Dussel argues that this conjuncture marks a new era in Marxian scholarship, which he calls Marx's second century. Dussel suggests that we should return to Marx's text with the enthusiasm of youth and deepen our understanding in order to further develop Marx's theory and to put it to use in the service of the liberation of Latin America and the rest of the world. The most important contributions of Marx's theory, according to Dussel, lie in the future. Marx's second century will be much better than the first. Dussel also argues that further advances in Marxian theory are more likely to come from the underdeveloped periphery of the world capitalist economy rather than from that of the advanced countries, because the need for Marxian theory is so much greater in the impoverished periphery. Critical theory, Dussel argues, follows hunger, the desire to eat. Please note the epigraph at the beginning of this introduction. Dussel's work itself is an excellent example of significant new developments in Marxian theory coming from the underdeveloped periphery of global capitalism. Hopefully, translations of the other two books in Dussel's trilogy on Marx's economic manuscripts will soon follow. Dussel's books are not the final word on Marx's economic manuscripts and Marx's economic theory, but they do represent a major step forward and should stimulate much further in-depth study and discussion of all four drafts of Capital in Marx's economic manuscripts. This is Fred Mosley's editorial introduction, and I think you can see kind of where he's coming from in terms of the references. Author's introduction. In 1932, with the publication of the Economic and Philosophical Manuscripts of 1844, and the famous Reflections by Herbert Marcuse, there began a revision of Marx's thought, a reaction to the extreme economists, a reaction to the extreme economism and ingenuous, not ingenious, ingenuous materialism of Soviet Marxism. In 1939, the Grundrisse was published, but went unnoticed, owing to the Second World War. A second edition appeared in 1954, which did not improve matters much. It wasn't until 1968, with the publication of Roman Rozdalsky's The Making of Marx's Capital, that a rediscovery of the historical evolution of Marx's creative thought occurred. The manuscripts of 1861 to 63, the subject of this book, is a second draft of Capital, following the Grundrisse of 1857 to 58. These manuscripts were published for the first time in German from 1976 to 1982. They include the three previously known volumes of Theories of Surplus Value, now critically edited. The third draft of Capital was the manuscripts of 1863 to 65, published in 1988. That's Miga 2, Book 7, Volume 1, which includes the famous unpublished Chapter 6 of Volume 1 of Capital from 1864 and the Manuscript 1 of Volume 2, hitherto totally unknown. Manuscript 1 of Volume 3 followed. That's Mega 2, 7, Volume 2, which meant that this third draft of Capital was known for the first time. Furthermore, two new critical editions of Volume 1 of Capital appeared in 1988, the fourth draft of Capital, the first edition of 1867, Miga 2, 5, and the second edition of 1873, Miga 2, 6. Today, it's fashionable to consider ourselves in a period of post-Marxism. I think that especially in Latin America, but also in Europe and the United States, rather than being In a period of post-Marxism, we are in a time of serious, measured, profound re-encounter with Marx himself. In the second century of Marxism, if one considers the first to be 1883 to 1983, we will rediscover in Marx a source of scientific thinking that can be used today more than in the 19th century for a critique of globalized capitalism. Subsection 1, which I mentioned earlier, between August 1861 and July 1863, Marx wrote 23 notebooks, which were published in German for the first time between 1967 and 1982. This material was consulted by Engels and Kautsky in order to publish the so-called books 2, 3, and 4 of Capital. Unknown to the later Marxian tradition, these notebooks consist of 1,472 manuscript pages, which add up to 2,384 printed pages in the German edition and 5 volumes in the English edition, 1989. This huge body of material, which Marx briefly described in the preface to Book 2 of Capital, is an intermediate stage between the Grundrisse of 1857 to 8 and the writing of the manuscripts of 63 to 65 and Book 1 of Capital, which was published in 1867. Up to this moment, I've not found a book which deals in extenso with all these manuscripts of 1861 to 63, although there are some partial works, such as Wygotsky of 78 and 65, Miller of 78, Tuchscherer of 68, and the Project Group 1975. Also, and lastly, there's also the recent work of various authors, among them the publishers of the manuscripts of 1861 to 63 of Wolfgang and Muller of 1983, footnote 4. Now, during these 2 years, when Marx was 42 to 45 years old, from August 61 to July 1863, Marx was living in London at 9 Grafton Terrace, not far from the beautiful Hampstead Heath, the park in which Marx loved to walk whenever he was able to, and near Highgate Cemetery, where he is buried. Those were very hard times for Marx and his family. Poverty, almost misery, sickness, and even solitude. The International Workingmen's Association was founded in 1864, were a constant worry for the, up to that moment, almost ignored German exiled in London. On 25 January, or in 25 February 1862, on 25 February 1862, Marx wrote to Engels telling him that taking all in all, leading such a dog's life is hardly worthwhile. MECW 41, page 341, footnote 5. And on 18 June 1862, he communicated again to his friend Engels. Every day my wife says she wishes she and the children were safely in their graves, and I really cannot blame her for the humiliations, torments, and alarms that one has to go through in such a situation are indeed indescribable. MECW 41, page 380. In September of that year, the desperate Marx considered abandoning his studies in order to devote himself to feeding his family. For this purpose, he intended to work as an employee on London's railway, but he failed the admissions exam because of his bad handwriting. Years later, on 30 April 1867, he wrote about this dark time. I had to make use of every moment when I was capable of work to complete my book, to which I have sacrificed my health, my happiness, and family. If one wanted to be an ox, one could, of course, turn one's back on the sufferings of humanity and look after one's own hide. But I should really have thought myself impractical if I had pegged out without finally completing my book, at least in manuscript, MECW 42, page 366. Still worse, in 1860, Marx had to lose time and energy in order to write the self-defense manuscript against Vogt, VOGT, since In his solitude and difficulties, he thought such an attack would destroy his future political and even personal possibilities. In reality, this defense was a waste of time, but not for an entrapped Marx. On 23 February 1859, Marx wrote a kind of curriculum vitae in the preface to the contribution. In this writing, we find out what were his most important works up to that moment, his articles about the wood robberies and about the parceling of the land ownership in Mosul, the justification of his critique of French socialism and communism. I remember now having criticized Marxism during the 1970s, but Althusserian Marxism, although some thought I was criticizing Marx himself, the critique of Hegel's philosophy of right, the manifesto, the poverty of philosophy, a short writing on wages, and all the articles of the second period of the Rheinische Zeitung. And in the preface, Marx also mentioned the British Museum, which he started using in 1850. When he finished writing the preface, Marx wrote, "This sketch of my studies in the domain of political economy is intended to show that my views are the outcome of conscientious research carried on for many years." And we have some view of that in this figure 1 diagram of studies that were done in the British Museum's library and the writing done at home. In fact, long years of hard theoretical work had filled Marx's everyday life. His working technique was interrupted and limited by poverty, which demanded that he write his notebooks of abstracts in the British Museum, but maintained by a firm tenacity, founded in an ethical passion which departed from a commiseration for the pain of the poor, oppressed, and exploited. That's then reference to figure 1, which we just looked at. From Garland Street, Marx perhaps had access to the museum's library, which since 1857, when he started the Grundrisse, had a huge, well lit dome. In desk 0-7, nobody knows for sure, he read the hundreds of books quoted in his work. He prepared a quotation notebook, Zitatenheft, in the museum during the day, which was the one he used to write the 23 notebooks that constitute the manuscripts of 61 to 63. But in addition, he also used notebook 7 of the Grundrisse for notes in the museum from page 63b to page 192 of the manuscripts. For his writing at home, usually during the night, he also used his numerous notebooks from former years, 1851 to 56. There are also cases of clear consultation and even copying from the Grundrisse. Knowing Marx's existential anguish and the limits of his investigation technique, since he did not possess many books, his talent to overcome so many adversities is overwhelming. His text is clean, coherent, profound. However, he was not satisfied with it. It was not yet ready for publication, although the work is before his eyes like an artistic whole. The artist does not feel expressed in it. And consequently, as with many other works, he shall deliver it to the rodent's critique. As in the case of the Grundrisse, we shall enter into Marx's own laboratory and see how he develops concepts, constructs categories. We shall see where there is progress in relation to the Grundrisse, but we also shall see his immaturity if we compare these manuscripts with Capital. Marx was not like Nietzsche, who used to write aphorisms on the run with, inspiration in his pen. By contrast, Marx needed to meditate. Yes, meditate. Marx needed to meditate about the plans of his future work, which would move the foundations of world history in the 20th century. There are at least some 19 plans up to 30 April of 1868. The first 10 plans have already been discussed in a former work, that is the Dussel work of 1985, section 2.4. Now it's time to depart from Engels' letter of 13 January 1859. Quote, The manuscript amounts to about 12 sheets of print, 3 installments, and don't be bowled over by this, although entitled Capital in General, these installments contain nothing as yet on the subject of capital, but only the 2 chapters. That is, number 1, the commodity, number 2, money or simple circulation, MECW 40, page 368, close quote. The first part of this work was conceived in 4 sections. The first of these sections was on capital. The other 3 would be competition credit and stock capital. Marx was planning this book as the first of 6 books. The others would be number 2, rent, number 3, wages, number 4, the state, number 5, international relations, and 6, the world market. At this moment, the section on capital had 3 chapters, commodity, money, and capital. As such, Marx failed in his attempt to write the chapter on money in the so-called or text of 1858, see Dussel 1985, section 16.3. For this reason, the manuscripts of 1861 to 63 begin with chapter 3. Quote, a contribution to the critique of political economy is announced on the cover of the first notebook of this manuscript's 3rd chapter. Capital in General, August 1861, 3rd chapter, Capital in General, MECW 30, pages 5 through 6. Therefore, all the manuscripts of 1861 to 63 should be considered as parts of chapter 3. But in reality, and very soon, Marx understood that it was a lot of material for a single chapter. As a consequence of his inquiry, the primitive plan expanded into many parts. In a letter to Wiedemeyer, dated 1 February 1859, he points out in detail the outline of the contribution, with differences, though. His future work would consist then of 6 books. The first book is divided into 4 parts. The first part in 3 chapters, commodity, money, and capital. The same pattern is repeated in the first lines of the preface to the contribution to the, critique of political economy. At the time he finished writing the contribution and was looking forward to starting chapter 3, promised to the publisher as an installment, Marx started the theoretical work on capital itself. Namely, he started preparing analytical plans on the subject. Now, for this purpose, he decided to begin with to write a review of my own notebooks, as he wrote in a summary of the Grundrisse notebooks, capital M 1 through 7, B prime, comma B prime, and B prime, B1 and B2. In February 1859, MECW 29, pages 518 to 32. It is very important to remember this review for the reading of the manuscripts of 1861 to 3 because we can see in it Marx's perception of the subject still belonging to the Grundrisse. We shall return to this matter below. In February or March of the same year, or maybe later, Marx clearly elaborated a plan for chapter 3, Roman numeral 3, which was never published after all. In this plan, which is at the same time a review of the Grundrisse, which shows Marx's form of work shown in figure 1, the plan of notebooks 1 through 5 of these manuscripts of 61 to 63 is found to be almost the same, with just a few changes. The similarity between this plan and the one considered for the writing of these notebooks is so great that one can assume that when writing his notes, Marx, in fact, had this draft project of February to March 1859 or of the summer of 1861 before him. Words and even concepts are the same. The usefulness of this plan, on the other hand, lies in the fact that it allows us to know exactly which text of the Grundrisse Marx is referring to. Articulation of the plan is as follows. Roman numeral 1, the production process of capital. Subsection 1, transformation of money into capital. Further subsection, A, transition, B, exchange between capital and labor capacity, C, labor process, D, valorization process. We're still in major section 1 of the production process of capital, section 2, subsection 2, absolute surplus value, subsection 3, relative surplus value divided among A, simple cooperation, B, labor division, C, machinery. Still in 1 and subsection 4, original accumulation, and subsection 5, subsection 5, wage, labor, and capital. Manifestation of the law of appropriation is in the simple circulation of commodities inversion of this law, MECW 29, pages 511 to 17. Now, regarding the outline of the manuscripts of 61 to 63, there are only small differences, which indicate that from March 1859 to August 1861, a maturing process took place. As an example, in 1859, he speaks in 1 beta of exchange between capital and labor capacity, while in August 61, money replaces capital. That is, exchange between capital and labor capacity, and then money replaces capital. So it's money and labor capacity. In other words, in 1859, Marx was not clearly aware that the first confrontation was between money, which was not yet capital. So 1859, right? This plan still includes a second part on circulation process of capital, which would be the future book 2 of capital, and a third part on capital and profit, which we discuss in chapter 10. Besides the letter to Kugelman of 28 December 1862, we must analyze, when the time comes, the whole plan of 1863, which shows all the advances of the manuscripts herein commented upon, footnote 8. But the main problem is not just to reach clarity regarding the plans, but also regarding the development of concepts and the construction of categories with which the dialectical discourse of the critique of the bourgeois political economy had to be articulated. New categories were required, as well as a new system, as the condition of possibility of a new order of the concepts, which is shown in the plan. So, considering the theoretical laboratory work included in the manuscripts of 61 to 63, we can point out in a general form that it is a much more advanced analysis than that in the Grundrisse, and this has to be demonstrated in each case. That's probably the more important part, but not as developed as in the manuscripts of 63 to 65, and capital, which also has to be indicated, footnote 9. So, what are the theoretical advances of these manuscripts of 1861 to 63? What are the points where the advances are obvious and clear? We shall see all of this during the development of our commentary as we pass from one chapter to another. But from the beginning, we would like to emphasize several key issues. In the first place, let us recall that the manuscripts of 1861 to 63 include 3 stages of writing and subjects. Number 1, from August 61 to March 62, Marx wrote notebooks 1 through 5, which comprise the subject matter of the future book 1 of Capital, but only up to the subject of relative surplus value. At this point, Marx interrupted his writing in order to ensure what had already been accomplished. And this is Dussel's chapters 1 to 3. Now, number 2, from March 1862 to November of the same year, he wrote notebooks 6 through 15, up to handwritten page 944 of the manuscripts. Marx constructed new categories and deepened his articulation of the subject of surplus value from various historical perspectives in the volumes called Theories of Surplus Value. This is MECW 30 through MECW 32, our chapters 4 through 9. Number 3, from November 1862 to July 1863, notebooks 15 to 23, Marx developed several subjects which would correspond to books 2 and 3 of Capital. In the last part, he returned to issues supplementary to notebooks 1 through 5, but he also discussed the subject of the future book 2 on reproduction and book 3, profit, production, price, etc. Our chapters 10 to 11. So Dussel is nothing if but being systematic. After these manuscripts, Marx then wrote the manuscripts of 63 to 65, 1863 to 1865, of which up to the present time only the one called Unpublished Chapter 6 is known, which included a draft of the future book 2 of Capital and the only draft of book 3 used by Engels for its publication in 1894. And that's part of the reason why I wanted to look at that version, the folks Mosley version first, and discussions on rent before we started Dussel, because at some moment we're going to read the full manuscripts after going through this analysis, and look for any other things. Because and it's not because we mistrust Engels, it's just simply that there is likely a difference, perhaps not yet plumbed, in the 1864 to 65 translation. Let us return then to our subject, but starting with an example which could guide us. The category of surplus value is a complex one, namely, it presupposes for its construction the fruit of a theoretical productive development, many other more simple categories. In order to construct the category of surplus value, at least the category of surplus value, surplus time, or surplus labor was required. Surplus value, surplus time, surplus labor. To constitute this category, it was necessary to develop the category of necessary time. The latter, on the other hand, requires the category of labor capacity, and this one, at the same time, the category of living labor as the creative source of value with no value at all, and the latter, by contradiction, requires the category of course, objectified past labor as variable capital, money expressed in wages, which pays the value of labor capacity. So there are many things there. Living labor, on the other hand, not only opposes objectified past labor, that is money or capital, but in addition, concrete labor, which produces use values, and abstract labor, which determines exchange values, must also be distinguished in it, from which the category of value shall be obtained. By means of all the foregoing, the complex category of surplus value can be constructed. Now, in these manuscripts of 1861 to 63, Marx constituted new categories. Figure 2, demanded by a dialectical discourse which is entering reality, the essential structure of the real, developing its concept, and thus he needs new hermeneutical instruments. Hermeneutical, hopefully you recall, hermeneutics is, authorial interpretation stuff. To discover, on our part, the necessity of these categories is really to understand Marx, to discover his method, the content and the order of his categories. This would enable the Latin American philosopher and economist to develop, as Marx did, the new categories required by our unique original reality. That is, reality is original, not philosophy. The development of the concept of capital and the constitution of categories, on the other hand, is a process which establishes a relationship with reality itself, which on its part is equally a concrete historical process. Engels wrote clearly that the concept, the Begriff of a thing, the Sach, and its reality, Wirklichkeit, run side by side, concept and reality run side by side like two asymptotic lines, always approaching each other, but never meeting. It is the case of an essential infinite process, he says in the same letter, of the non-coincidence of concept with reality and of concept with its phenomena, with its appearance. The Erscheinung. Let us take a few pages from the manuscripts of 61 to 63, notebooks 6 to 8. Marx distinguishes first between intuition and concept. In one passage of Petty's, there can be seen an intuition, an Ahnung of the nature of surplus value, although of rent. MECW 31, page 78 to 9. So we're at figure 2 here, and we probably should just stop at figure 2 because we are at the end of our time, I think. Yes. But I would note, of course, here, living labor is, it's where we are. As we live and breathe. We develop exchange value and use value, assessing value in the world. We encounter objectified past labor in the form of other stuff, material stuff, as opposed to, thinking or breathing or whatever, seeing. And so value on this side becomes surplus value, and on this side becomes objectified past labor is variable capital, which is reflected in wages and unpaid time. And so this is the productive force side. And so it is this tension, of course, between unpaid time and wages that, from which we develop the difference between labor capacity relative to the as it were, the indexicality of wages and labor capacity and the specification of necessary time and or sufficient time, we might even talk about, as opposed to surplus time and surplus labor, which is, of course, unpaid time. So here we have surplus value, surplus time, surplus labor, all of these essentially, boiling down to surplus value. And understanding the surplus value is not, it's not, it is an abstraction, right? I mean, you sort of don't think that you're making surplus value, even though you are. And it is that difference, that kind of tension, I think that's really important. So anyway, figure 2 is where we leave off. So tomorrow we will move from figure 2 to the end and then start because I think that's a good place to leave off. Part 1, the central notebooks of chapter 3, the production process of capital. So we're going to plow through this thing eventually, not perhaps in order, because I'd like to uh, uh, um, look at Saito's book on Friday. So we'll get as far as we can get here, hopefully get to the end of chapter 1. And I think we can. I mean, I think as you can see, as we scroll past here, it's sort of doable in the next day or two, right? And not wholly problematic. So we only have a couple more things to worry about. But this is an important chapter, needless to say, because it forms the front end of the manuscripts of discussing the manuscripts of 61 to 63. Anyway, needless to say, I'm done. Let me go back to the meeting, end the live stream,